Imagine opening a package, expecting a routine delivery, and instead watching your hands explode in front of your eyes. In 1978, a mysterious bomber began attacking universities across America. No fingerprints, no witnesses, no clear motive. For 18 years, the FBI hunted a ghost. He lived alone in a tiny wooden cabin hidden deep in the Montana wilderness, with no electricity, no running water, and a hatred for modern society so intense that he was willing to kill for it. But the most terrifying part, the man behind the bombings was a mathematical genius with an IQ higher than Einstein's. And the only person who could stop him was his own brother. Tonight, we uncover the horrifying true story of Ted Kaczynski, the man whose manifesto would inspire extremists for decades to come. And by the end of this story, you'll have to answer one question. Could one person's ideas become more dangerous than the bombs themselves? Chicago, Illinois, May 25, 1978. At Northwestern University, a campus security officer noticed a strange package sitting in a parking lot. It looked harmless, brown wrapping paper. No return address, simple string tied around the box. The officer handed it to campus police officer Terry Marker. The moment Marker opened it, boom, the package exploded directly into his hands. Shrapnel ripped through his body. Smoke filled the air. Students screamed and ran. Luckily, he survived. At first, investigators thought it might be a prank gone wrong, but then another bomb appeared. And another, and another. The targets seemed random. University professors, airline executives, computer store owners, scientists. Nobody understood the pattern. But one thing quickly became clear. Whoever was building these devices was extremely intelligent. The bombs were handmade with incredible precision, wooden parts instead of metal, false clues deliberately planted to confuse investigators. No usable fingerprints. The bomber even carved the initials FC into some components. The FBI had no idea what it meant. But soon, America would give the unknown attacker a name. Unabomber, short for University and Airline Bomber. And the case would become one of the largest manhunts in FBI history. Long before the bombings, there was a quiet little boy from Chicago who seemed destined for greatness. Ted Kaczynski was born in 1942. From a very young age, he displayed extraordinary intelligence. By age 16, he was accepted into Harvard University. 16. While most teenagers were worrying about high school dances, Ted was studying advanced mathematics among elite scholars. But Harvard wasn't a normal experience for him. He was socially isolated, emotionally detached, painfully shy. Some classmates later described him as cold and distant. Others barely remembered him speaking at all. And during his years at Harvard, Ted participated in controversial psychological experiments conducted by Professor Henry Murray. Students were intentionally humiliated, verbally attacked, and psychologically pressured while researchers monitored their reactions. Some investigators later questioned whether these experiments contributed to Ted's deteriorating mental state. After Harvard, Ted earned a PhD in mathematics from the University of Michigan. His professors considered him brilliant. One described his mathematical proofs as almost impossible to understand because they were so advanced. At just 25 years old, Ted became the youngest assistant professor at University of California, Berkeley. He had everything: prestige, intelligence, a promising future. And then he suddenly quit, no explanation, no warning. He disappeared from society entirely. In the early 1970s, Ted moved to a remote area outside Lincoln, Montana. There, he built a tiny cabin with his own hands. It was only about 10 by 12 feet. No electricity, no plumbing, no modern comforts. He hunted rabbits, collected water manually, lived almost completely isolated from humanity. But deep inside that cabin, something dark was growing. Ted became obsessed with the idea that modern technology was destroying human freedom. He believed industrial society turned people into machines. According to Ted, technology made humans weaker, dependent, and psychologically broken. At first, his frustrations stayed in notebooks and journals. Then they became violence. Inside the cabin, Ted taught himself how to build bombs using scrap materials. He studied chemistry, experimented with explosives, tested triggering mechanisms. Every device became more sophisticated than the last. And because he worked alone in total isolation, the FBI had almost nothing to trace. No phone records, no accomplices, no digital footprint. Just bombs. As the years passed, the attacks became deadlier. Victims were maimed, blinded, disfigured, some lost fingers, others suffered permanent hearing damage. Then the killings began. In 1985, computer store owner Hugh Scruton became the first person killed by one of Ted's bombs. The device was hidden behind pieces of wood in a parking lot. When Scruton moved the debris, the bomb exploded instantly. The force tore through his chest and face. Investigators realized they weren't dealing with a prankster anymore. This was a calculated serial killer. And the bomber was evolving. Ted deliberately avoided patterns. Sometimes he mailed bombs, sometimes he planted them by hand. He used homemade components impossible to trace commercially. Even the wood inside the bombs was carved and shaped with obsessive care. FBI profilers believed the bomber was likely highly educated, socially isolated, skilled with tools, deeply resentful toward modern society, but none of those clues led anywhere. Years turned into a decade. The bomber vanished between attacks, sometimes for years at a time. Then suddenly, another explosion. Another victim. Another dead end. America became terrified of opening packages. Airlines increased security. Universities warned professors. The FBI spent millions chasing shadows. Still, nothing. By the early 1990s, the Unabomber investigation had become the longest and most expensive manhunt in FBI history. More than 150 full-time investigators worked the case. Thousands of suspects were interviewed. The FBI analyzed typewriter ribbons, glue residue, postage stamps, linguistic patterns, bomb fragments. Psychological profilers built detailed personality assessments. One profile suggested the bomber might be an airline mechanic. Another believed he could be a radical environmentalist. Others thought he might be living in a major city. Nobody imagined the killer was living in a primitive cabin hidden in the Montana wilderness, and then the bomber escalated again. In 1994, advertising executive Thomas Mosser was killed by a mail bomb sent to his home. 1 year later, timber industry lobbyist Gilbert Murray was murdered the same way. Now the death toll stood at 3. The injured numbered over 20. The bomber's confidence was growing. And soon he would make an unprecedented demand. In 1995, newspapers and television stations across America received a shocking letter. The Unabomber claimed responsibility for the attacks, but this time he offered a deal. If major newspapers published his 35,000-word manifesto, he would stop bombing. The document was titled Industrial Society and Its Future. Inside, Ted argued that modern technology was destroying human freedom and human happiness. He believed society had become psychologically sick. Machines controlled people. Corporations manipulated behavior. Technology erased individuality. Some of his arguments sounded strangely thoughtful. Others were deeply paranoid and extremist. The FBI faced a horrifying decision. Should they publish the words of a terrorist? After intense debate, the New York Times and the Washington Post agreed to print the manifesto as a special supplement. Not because they supported it, but because investigators hoped someone might recognize the writing style. And someone did. In Schenectady, New York, a man named Ted Kaczynski began reading the manifesto. At first he felt uneasy. Certain phrases sounded familiar. Certain arguments echoed conversations from years earlier. Then the realization hit him like a nightmare. The author might be his brother Ted. David desperately wanted to be wrong. He reread old family letters, compared writing styles, analyzed phrases. The similarities were overwhelming. Imagine the horror of suspecting that your own brother might be America's most wanted terrorist. David faced an impossible moral choice: protect his family or stop a killer. For weeks, he agonized over the decision. Finally, he contacted authorities through an attorney. The FBI secretly began comparing Ted's old writings to the manifesto. The match was undeniable. After nearly 2 decades, they finally had their suspect. April 3, 1996. FBI agents surrounded Ted Kaczynski's cabin near Lincoln, Montana. The structure looked almost unreal. Tiny, weathered, hidden among trees. Agents expected to find a disturbed recluse. What they discovered instead shocked them. Inside the cabin were bomb-making chemicals, pipe bombs, detailed journals, explosive components, victim lists, drafts of the manifesto. Investigators realized they had entered the operational center of one of the most sophisticated domestic terror campaigns in American history. Ted himself appeared calm during the arrest. Thin, bearded, emotionless. The FBI later uncovered journals documenting the bombings in chilling detail. Ted wrote about victims almost like scientific experiments. There was no remorse, only justification. The ghost America had hunted for 18 years was finally real. And he had been living in isolation the entire time. After his arrest, psychologists tried to understand Ted Kaczynski's mind. How could someone so intelligent become a serial bomber? Several experts diagnosed him with paranoid schizophrenia. Others debated whether he was legally insane. Ted rejected claims of mental illness. He insisted his actions were rational political resistance against technological society. His IQ reportedly measured around 167, higher than many famous scientists and intellectuals. But intelligence alone does not protect someone from psychological collapse. In Ted's case, his brilliance may have intensified his isolation. He struggled to connect emotionally with others. He viewed society with deep hostility. And over time, his ideology hardened into violent extremism. Yet what disturbed investigators most was that parts of his manifesto resonated with people long before social media addiction, before mass surveillance, before algorithms shaped human behavior. Ted warned that technology could dominate human life. Some readers saw fragments of truth inside his writings. But the bombings overshadowed everything, because no matter how intellectual the arguments sounded, he murdered innocent people to spread them. Ted Kaczynski eventually accepted a plea deal to avoid the death penalty. He was sentenced to life in federal prison without parole. For many Americans, the nightmare was finally over. But the Unabomber's influence did not disappear. Over the years, extremists from different ideologies cited his manifesto. Some admired his anti-technology beliefs. Others copied his methods of lone wolf terrorism. Security experts later warned that Ted helped create a terrifying blueprint, a single isolated individual using homemade weapons to spread fear nationwide without belonging to any organized group. In many ways, the Unabomber case predicted the modern era of domestic extremism. And perhaps that's what makes the story so disturbing. Ted Kaczynski wasn't hiding in a foreign country. He wasn't commanding an army. He was one isolated man in a wooden cabin who managed to terrify an entire nation for nearly 2 decades. Today, the tiny Montana cabin sits preserved as evidence of one of America's darkest criminal cases, a symbol of paranoia, isolation, and ideological violence. The Unabomber believed technology was destroying humanity. Ironically, modern technology is exactly what keeps his ideas alive today. Videos, forums, manifestos, algorithms. His words continue spreading across the internet he hated so much. And maybe that raises the most uncomfortable question of all: if a dangerous idea can survive forever online, can society ever truly stop people like Ted Kaczynski?